what is your position on the so-called humanitarian intervention responsibility to protect efforts done in the name of human rights?
You know, I was involved slightly in one in my youth. I worked in the White House on the Kosovo bombings. I've generally concluded since then that almost all humanitarian interventions are bad ideas, whether because they're pretextual and mask other agendas, or because even when humanitarian, they almost unfailingly make the world worse off. So I think that aside from being illegal, we should just have, you know, moral reservations about the rise of humanitarian intervention. Its rebranding as the responsibility to protect, which wrought havoc in Libya when it was invoked by this UN Security Council to justify intervention that became regime change there. So, you know, I hope everyone's learned to be much more cautious than we were for the last couple of decades, and kind of take the record seriously that that for the abuses that humanitarian intervention allows, and even the well-meaning uses prove, you know, to lead to worse outcomes, and it's just hard then to ever justify one again outside, you know, very kind of narrow circumstances. Like, for example, it may have, you know, been ethically and politically justifiable for Obama to protect the Yazidis, which was an extremely localized event, and, you know, relied on local participation, you know, to provide an exit to those who were under threat. But that's like an exception that proves the rule.
But it appears that those who are advising Joe Biden, including Ambassador Rice and others, are not learning those lessons. They believe in this.
That's right. No, we're all watching expectantly. If Biden wins, which seems to be in the cards, some of those like Susan Rice and Samantha Power will have the reins again in these, and will influence these decisions more than you or I will. Now, in fairness, their defining experience, especially Rice, was Rwanda. And I don't, you know, begrudge them their learning from inaction, but it's troubling that they haven't gone on to learn from action, since both of them, as their memoirs recount, were instrumental in the decision to intervene in Libya with disastrous consequences. You know, more than that, they were very insistent on some more intensive intervention in Syria, even though I think that the disaster of Libya was on the minds not just of China and Russia, and China especially cited Libya as a ground for its veto of various Security Council resolutions on Syria. But, you know, the whole world really was soured on humanitarian intervention by the choices of these actors, you know, who are going to be back in power, as you say. So once again, it falls on the rest of us to constrain our leaders and make sure that the lessons we have taken from history are ones that they, you know, take more seriously.
But you have pointed out that humanitarian intervention can be a mask, and one can reasonably argue that there were other interests involved in getting rid of Gaddafi, and that these countries, Syria and Venezuela, have significant oil reserves and governments which do not agree with Washington, D.C. and are disobedient.
Right.
Do you believe that this is really about being influenced by Uganda, and that these politicians, diplomats, are to be trusted?
Well, I do think Rwanda played a big role for Rice and really the kind of record of the 1990s for power. But you're of course right that the moral imperatives are not the only one that politicians experience as important. And moreover, there are structural forces that, for which these individuals become the agents, sometimes without their intention, playing, their conscious attention at least playing the biggest role. So I think we go back to the fact that, as some have observed, there is never going to be a pure humanitarian intervention. So the real question is whether any are justifiable, even so. And maybe there's a case that you can imagine even an illegal humanitarian intervention that, is justifiable. I think it's just going to be incredibly rare. And we need to have all of our, let's say, our cynicism about ulterior motives and, pretextual abuse, even to the extent we hold out the possibility someday of a humanitarian intervention that might be worth endorsing. Precisely for that reason, we have to, make sure that we have understood the situation, and, above all, understood the likely consequences of our actions. It's very interesting. In Samantha Power's memoir, she recounts that the very first time she met Barack Obama, he said, "Is it just your morality that matters, or don't you have to consider the likely outcomes of your actions in the name of even good principles?" And, that's an incredibly wise thing to say. And, the trouble is he didn't take his own insights seriously enough in the Libyan situation. He did more so in Syria, I believe.
Well, but if the aim was to get rid of Gaddafi and his project to establish an African currency, then it worked.
That's true. So, I think as of today, we don't know who precisely and on what grounds precisely the decision was made to outrun the Security Council's humanitarian permission slip to intervene to save the citizens of Benghazi and others, and why precisely that permission slip was converted into a blank check for regime change. It would be nice to know, and you've made a guess about what was really going on. Clearly, it will involve the Americans and the French, and documents that are not yet in our possession. I hope they are someday, because as with many of these interventions, even the Iraq intervention in 2003, it's actually, staggeringly unknown why they took the form they did, why they happened, whether they what interests were actually decisive, and yet, you know, going forward, clearly we need to always remember that there may be such hidden, you know, causes for acts that are advertised as morally uplifting, and make sure not to, as we say in English, believe the hype.
I have covered the controversy surrounding the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons and the Duma incident. And Aaron Matea of The Nation has written about it and has recently participated in a hearing.